In this video, we'll continue our discussion of the autonomic nervous system. In the first video, we really introduced the basics, that a little bit about what it does and the basic format, that there are two neurons are required between the spinal cord and the target. And we also introduced the concept that when we look at the sympathetic, the preganglionic fiber tends to be short and the postganglionic tends to be quite long as it travels to the target. Whereas parasympathetic, we have the opposite, is that the preganglionic is the long one and postganglionic tends to be the short one. Now, we're going to go into more depth now, is that the sympathetic nervous system. Where do these fibers leave the central nervous system? Well, the sympathetic nervous system, its fibers leave in the area of the thorax and the lumbar area of the spinal cord, which is why it's often known as a thoracolumbar division. Now remember that the presynaptic and postsynaptic have to synapse somewhere, and it's in a ganglia. So for the sympathetic nervous system, there are a series of ganglia that are quite close to the spinal cord on both sides of the spinal cord. So most sympathetic ganglia are located near the spinal cord. And this is, as I said, is where the preganglionic will synapse with the postganglionic, and then the postganglionic will continue off to their target. Now, let's remind ourselves is that the sympathetic nervous system, often it's described as fight or flight, and that is a good description, but it could be a bit misleading, is that it makes it sound as if it only works under very special circumstances, but it works all the time. It's about upregulating things like heart rate, respiration, BP, but it does have a role in emergency situations. It helps to maintain homeostasis when you're involved in physical activity, and also has a role. It helps to mediate the body's response to emotional stimuli. Now let's talk about the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic, where does it leave the central nervous system? And in this case, it leaves it's located with some of the cranial nerves in the brainstem, and it also exits in the sacral region, and that is why it's often referred to as the craniosacral division. Now, the cranial nerves that we're talking about innervate core structures in the head, neck, thoracic viscera, and most of the abdominal viscera. Now, we also, as we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, we have things like sacral nerves that will come off the parasympathetic and be involved with that. And what does the parasympathetic do for you? The parasympathetic really has a big role in things like down-regulating much of the body's response to work. So it has a role in digestion, maintaining the body's homeostasis at rest. And just remember that general theme that the preganglionic is quite a long fiber and the postganglionic in the parasympathetic nervous system is the short one. Here we can see a diagram that covers many of the things that we talked about. So the middle region here of the spinal cord in the area of the thorax and the lumbar region, this is where the sympathetic fibers leave the spinal cord. And in many cases, they'll leave the spinal cord and they will synapse in the series of connected ganglia that are on both sides of the spinal cord. This is known as the sympathetic chain, and there's one on each side of the spinal cord. And the preganglionic, in many cases, synapses here, and then the postganglionic heads off to the target. And we'll come back about how some of these connections are made. Now, just to give you a heads up, there are some sympathetic preganglionic fibers that do not synapse in this ganglionic chain. They actually pass through it, but they do have their own special ganglia because remember, you need to synapse before you get to the target. And we'll come back and explore that in more detail in the next video. Now, let's have a look at the general structure of the parasympathetic. As we said, the parasympathetic, the fibers come off from the brainstem and from the sacral region. Now, up here in the brainstem, not surprisingly, many of these are associated with cranial nerves. And the preganglionic tend to be very long fibers. We have a synapse in a ganglia, and the postganglionic head off to targets. And down here in the sacral region, we see the same thing. Long preganglionic, we have specific ganglia in which it will synapse and then off to the target. And as I said before, sometimes these preganglionic go almost all the way to the target and then synapse at the last minute to fulfill the requirement that you need 2 neurons. Now, let's talk a bit about it. Is that, as you already got the sense, is that often they're antagonistic, that one will upregulate something and the other will downregulate something. And that's the case quite often, is that we have this dual nature that sympathetic will upregulate something and then parasympathetic will downregulate it. So they antagonize each other to help to maintain homeostasis. And together they hopefully maintain that delicate balance. Now, that being said, there are a few cases where it's not an equal sharing of duties, where parasympathetic and sympathetic work together equally. That there are some situations where only one of the systems is really in charge, and then it modifies activity in a different way, which we'll talk about in the future. Okay, so we're going to end this video here, and the next one we'll come back and start to talk about some of the arrangements of the pre- and postganglionic fibers in the sympathetic nervous system.